This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, a warm welcome to you all for this final session entitled The Politics of Localisation. I'd like to briefly introduce our three speakers and then ask them to deliver their papers, please no more than about 15 minutes, and then turn over to you for questions and comments back to the panel. Our first speaker today will be John Ducker. John, who served as Assistant Secretary in Aden and then Assistant Advisor in the Protectorate from 1960 to 1967, then moving to the World Bank until 1993, where he served in a number of different territories, and interestingly was the man to close the door in Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion. After the Soviet invasion, yes, after the Soviet, which I think is quite something. John then continued to work for the World Bank and for the United Nations in Central Asia with a range of government departments. And you probably know this book of John's that he co-authored with Peter Hinchcliffe and Maria Holt, Without Glory in Arabia, and now here that it's available in paperback. Our second speaker today will be Simon Gillett. Simon, who served in the Cameroons and then went on to Bechuanaland and then Botswana as a district commissioner, where he stayed until 1972 before moving to the Commonwealth Secretariat. He then moved to Nauru in the Pacific, where he was head of the civil service, and then later became financial secretary in St. Helena in 1981, and moved on to serve on a number of UN posts. And he told me it was very much like the colonial service. Go and see for yourself. That was a big message that he took forward. Our final speaker today will be Michael Waters. At last I find a colonial police officer, or a former colonial police officer. Michael, who joined first the Pacific Islands Police as an inspector in 1972. He then moved to the Hong Kong Police, where he ended as acting senior superintendent in 1977, before moving into political service, where he became deputy director of the political department, leaving at handover in 1997. And Michael pointed out to me that he was probably the last person here in the room to join the colonial service, but he spent 27 years. So he had a full career. So if I could hand over then please to our first speaker, to John Ducker, who will be talking about localization in Aden and a comparative study across the colonies.
Maybe I better stand. This is there are two parts to this. I'll just say a little bit about Aden, and then I've been doing a lot of work recently on a book about decolonization more generally, in particular this question of localization. It hasn't been published yet. I hope it will be soon. Aden Colony, which was centered on Aden, the port of Aden, was a British colony from 1837 until 1967, and it was run by the Bombay Presidency from 1837 to 1930. While an Arab city, the population of Aden included a lot of Indians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Parsis, Christians, and there are also many Somalis, Jews, Lebanese, about 90,000 Yemeni Arabs, and other Arabs from around the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf. As a crown colony, Aden was administered by a governor and executive council, which by 1960 included 5 unofficials, 4 Arab and 1 Indian, a legislative council, and the usual range of government departments, staffed at the higher levels by the colonial service. Aden Protectorate was very different. It was a large large, lightly populated country ruled for the most of that period by local tribal leaders, and much more homogeneous as to their origins in religion than the colony. In the West Aden Protectorate, there were 17 small emirates, or similar. In the East Aden Protectorate, there were 3 larger states. Most of these were British protectorates from the mid-19th century onwards, and from the 1930s they were also signed separate treaty relationships with Britain, which provided for advice on matters of public policy, everything other than religion and Sharia law. The states made their own appointments of officials, largely from local Adenese, though the Gillett state in the East Aden Protectorate, for historical reasons, employed a few Indians and Pakistanis. While most of these states were ruled by their ruler, their emir, 2 of the East Aden Protectorate states had also appointed governors and district officers. They used the Turkish administrative terminology of naib, or governor, and gaim, or district officer. And from the 1950s onwards, there was training arranged for the naibs and gaims at conferences, and they were sent on individual training programs. British advice in the protectorates was provided by 2 resident advisors, one in the west and one in the east, and they had a small staff of assistant advisors and technical advisors and military and training officers. Within the colony, where the level of education was well above that of the protectorate, localization of the public service was in progress long before a formal localization policy was adopted. So that when I arrived in Aden in 1960, there were several Adenese in Exco. The Director of Education was an Aden, as were a number of other senior officers in other departments in the police. Nevertheless, there were a number of major staffing weaknesses in the civil service, and the output from the schools and colleges was still... So in 1957, under Governor Sir William Luce, an Adenization committee was established. Sir Arthur Charles, a former member of the Sudan Civil Service, was appointed as the chairman. In 1959, the Adenization Committee became a public service commission, still advisory to the governor, with Sir Arthur Charles sitting as the sole commissioner. In addition to the Adenization Committee, there was an Overseas Studies Board established in 1957 to push forward the training of younger staff and prepare more Adenese for appointment to the public service and the professions. A student office was opened in London with a senior officer in charge for people on training courses in England. Day-to-day personnel matters were handled by the establishments branch in the usual way. By early 1961, pressure was increasing to accelerate local appointments by the creation of supernumerary positions and appointments of some capable Adenese to vacancies ahead of expatriate members of the service. In February 1961, the Governor sought colonial office approval for the creation of 44 supernumerary posts and the supersession of 5 expatriates by appointment of local officers. The colonial office rejected this proposal, as it would have required the introduction of a compensation scheme well in advance of the stage reached in constitutional development. There was also expected to be sufficient expansion of the public service to permit plenty of local appointments. Furthermore, colonial office experience elsewhere had been that supernumerary posts tended to give rise to discord between the holders of the substantive and the supernumerary posts. Nigeria was the case quoted. Thus we can say that by 1961, the substitution of expatriates by Adenese in the public service was under active implementation, and this process proceeded in a typical fashion. This was all generally straightforward, but immediately the complexities began. First, who was to be eligible for appointment to the public service? EXCO took the ad hoc decision in regard to the colony only to define Adenese to exclude British protected persons other than those born in the Aden Protectorate. As a result, many Indians and most Somalis would not qualify for appointments. Neither would the 90,000 odd Yemenis working in the colony. However, this decision was purely pragmatic one. It wasn't a nationality law, which would be required later to determine the franchise. Second, the constitutional and political future of the territory was clouded, and it was not at all clear how things would evolve in the future. 6 of the Western Emirates had federated in 1959. Now consideration was being given to the colony joining an expanded federation. This posed a whole new range of problems of a political, constitutional, administrative and staffing nature. With the entry of the colony into the federation in 1963, the Public Service Commission was made responsible for the public service in both the federation and the colony, and the establishment department handled day-to-day personnel matters as before for both the colony and the federation. Still not quite clear to me how this happened, but somehow when the colony joined the federation, it remained a crown colony. That's a constitutional curiosity which I still wonder about. The complexity of these arrangements was exacerbated by the existence in Aden of a major military base, which had comprised some 15,000 servicemen with all their paraphernalia, 8 squadrons of the Air Force and naval facilities. Service families numbered some 9,000. The expansion of this base in Aden between 1957 and 1962 had been substantial and was an important aspect of Britain's defence policy. The forces based in Aden and Singapore were a major constituent of the Western Alliance against the Soviet threat in the Indian Ocean region and perceived threats to Middle Eastern oil. However, the existence of this large military setup had the effect of complicating the normal process of decolonisation in Aden. Britain's decision to support the incorporation of Aden colony within the Federation was opposed by many Adenese and by the government of Yemen. It gave a handle to those opposed to the perpetuation of British influence in South Arabia. The overlay of both military and civil appointments associated with the defence establishment on what appeared to many of us to be more generous terms and quite comfortable facilities, and which had little to do with local considerations, began to complicate the staffing and emoluments of the Aden service. And this became a matter of high policy as local constitutional proposals were formulated, which can be inferred from the following extract from a letter of April 1962 from the Governor, Sir Charles Johnston, to Sir Hilton Point in the Colonial Office. Quote, "We are embarking here on an experiment which is unprecedented. At the precise moment of time in constitutional development, when a colonial or protected territory normally expects to see some acceleration towards self-government, we are planning, after introducing the 2 constitutional steps now under discussion, to put our foot firmly on the brake and keep it there for a number of years. This too in circumstances which will put us under intense internal and external attack, as clinging to the last imperialist outpost in an otherwise independent Arab world. The resultant strains and stresses will be felt principally by the civil service and our moderate Arab friends. The course, therefore, which we intend to follow cannot, at the best, be an easy one, and will be impossible unless by understanding and by payment for the obvious advantages, we do everything we reasonably can to make it acceptable. It must be recognised that the length of our retention, as of right, of the Aden base will primarily be determined by our ability to deal with the political problems, and we shall not therefore be able to succeed if we attempt to do anything on these things on the cheap. The military and political aspects must be treated as 2 equally important and interdependent parts of a single exercise. So far as the expatriate staff in the Aden service were concerned, the decision was then taken to create an HMG staff pool under the authority of the High Commissioner, which was the title of the Governor after Aden joined the Federation. Staff in this pool were required to serve wherever the High Commissioner decided, in the colony in the federal departments or elsewhere in the non-federated states or the Protectorate Advisory Service, whatever their original terms of reference. In return, they would receive a special allowance. This was felt to be essential if there was to be any chance of implementing what was expected to be a difficult policy. Inevitably, however, the creation of this special allowance tended to undermine morale among local members of the service, as it was viewed as discriminatory. From 1963 onwards, the political and constitutional development of Aden and the Federation became increasingly difficult due to rising insecurity and terrorism, fostered and supported from external sources. The Adenization program could not fail to be affected by this, especially after Sir Arthur Charles, the chairman of the Commission, Public Service Commission, was assassinated in 1965. In 1964, the federal government had set up a committee on Arabization, consisting mainly of ministers, and this committee arrived at a definition of South Arabian and decided that no South Arabian who was suitable for appointment to the civil service would be denied an appointment for lack of a vacancy, or if any post he was qualified to fill was occupied by a non-South Arabian. The implication was that the Public Service Commission regulations would have to be amended to make this possible and be accompanied by a compensation scheme on the part of HMG. Particular problems arose in the case of the Aden police, where there was increasing pressure for promotion of senior Arab officers, and where all the staff of the special branch had been assassinated. Though progress was certainly made in localization, therefore, eventually it became the case that the more exposed appointments tended to be filled by those willing to serve there, rather than by the best available candidates, for it became increasingly risky to occupy some positions. Between 1964 and 1967, 18 British and 290 Adenese civilians were killed in Aden, more than the number of servicemen killed. Many of these were in the public service. In the year or so prior to the British withdrawal from the base in November 1967, and following HMG's notice of its intention to withdraw from the Protectorate and advisory treaties, rational staff planning became virtually impossible. In the end, loyalty to one or other of the rival political parties, which were at war with each other, became a factor in local appointments and the willingness of Adenese to serve. As a footnote, I would merely like to add that while the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which was the name of the territory after independence, became the sole Arab country which was avowedly communist, the impact of the education system and the localization program before independence was considerable. The new government, which was very disciplined, found the country easy to govern, as the systems, regulations and laws inherited from the period of British rule are ready to be adapted to the whole country. I will move on and make a few remarks about the comparative analysis of localization that I've been doing. First thing I'd like to say is that in all colonies, the progress of the localization program depended as much as anything upon the flow of qualified people being produced by the education system. So it's worth mentioning first a few facts about the growth of tertiary level education in the British dependencies. First universities in India, for comparison, were established in 1857, set 90 years before Indian independence. In Ceylon in 1922, 26 years before independence. Akimota in the Gold Coast began producing a small stream of graduates in the 1940s. The Aden University in Nigeria graduated its first students only 8 years before Nigerian independence in 1960. Makerere and Gordon College in Khartoum similarly. There were no universities in Central or Southern Africa until the late 1950s or early 60s, just prior to self-government. The Colonial Office had been critical of the educational developments in Nyasaland and Tanganyika in particular. the 10-year education plan for Tanganyika submitted by Governor Twining in 1950, its revision of 1951, and the 5-year plan produced in 1956 were all criticised by the Colonial Office on account of, quote, the pitifully small number of children sitting the Cambridge School Certificate. If Africans are to play a part in the development of the country within the next generation, the expansion of the secondary school system is urgent. In Nyasaland, the educational development was criticised because, quote, government had not played a sufficient part in education. The missions have been mainly interested in spreading a rudimentary education as widely as possible. Secondary education and teacher training had been neglected. Girls' education had lagged behind. There was, of course, a small stream of graduates from British universities in all territories, but they were obviously few. Thus, the localization policy was everywhere handicapped by the limited number of people with the graduate level qualifications required for discharging professional level tasks. Nearly everywhere it was found necessary to compromise by accepting prior experience in the public service at lower levels as being a sufficient alternative qualification for appointment to higher levels. Most countries found it necessary to promote staff beyond the level justified by their formal qualifications. Oh dear, I'm running out of time. I haven't finished. The localization program began with a formal staff planning exercise. In Sudan, this took place in 1944-46, in the Gold Coast in 41-43, Nigeria in 1948, later in East Central and Southern Africa. But the critical step was the creation of a public service commission with the powers to determine whether a local person had the capability of holding a professional level post and replacing an expatriate. In India, the PSC was created in 1886, 61 years before independence. In Ceylon, 17 years before independence. The only African territory where this step was taken more than 10 years before independence was Nigeria. And that was only 11 years before. So it is worth stressing that the process of localization took place in all the African territories with great rapidity. It was little different in the case of the West Indies and the Far East, though the education systems there were more advanced in some territories and there were more graduates available. So what the achievement of the education system? All right, but I was going on to give some country examples, but I better stop.
Perhaps you could bring that in case
later.
later
Yeah,
on.
right.
Thank you very much indeed. Move to you now.
Yes.
Discussion about Botswana.
I'd better keep to the minutes, sitting next to me. The politics of localization, government policies in the Bechuanaland Protectorate, and then in Botswana. First, in the Protectorate. Before 1960, the British government's policy was to facilitate the incorporation of the Protectorate with Bechuanaland and Swaziland in the Union of South Africa. Both officials and ministers of the Dominion's office, later the CRO, were very slow to admit that the Union was intensifying racial segregation and as a result, quote, native opinion, unquote, remains firmly opposed to incorporation in South Africa. Because of this and the poverty of the territory, the first secondary school did not open until 1954, and even at independence in 1966, there were only a handful of responsible posts filled by what the South African government would call Bantu or coloured people. In addition, however, there were a number of Europeans who in one or two cases had been born actually in Bechuanaland, but more often came from South Africa and Rhodesia. Most of them held middle-ranking posts, which in West or even East African territories would have been assigned to black Africans. A number of these Europeans, mostly female office staff, retired when the administrative headquarters of Bechuanaland moved from Mafeking in South Africa to Gaborone in 1964. A technical training centre was then set up. to train clerical and some technical staff, but it made little impact before independence. As for the police, localization posed special problems, as many of the more experienced African police were Basutos, and most of the European senior staff were South African or Rhodesian, and by and large unsympathetic to advancing non-white policemen's careers. The first step to a solution to this problem was the enlargement of the force and recruitment of, a lot of time, I think it was about 30 altogether, of inspector-level policemen from UK forces. Although in the administration there were 2 African district officers, one in charge of a district by 1965, and a third was appointed a permanent secretary before independence. Posts in the district administration and the new ministries were filled by expatriates with relevant overseas civil service experience, mainly in East Africa. There were also a number of younger men with the last pensionable appointment being made in 1963. Localizing these posts was clearly not going to be immediately practicable, as the University of Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland, UBLS, which was actually in Lesotholand only opened in 1960 and did not produce its first graduates to be appointed to the administrative civil service until after independence. The only technical departments before independence with any degree of localization were the education and medical departments, although in the latter only at nurse, dispenser and lab technician level. Neither the very important veterinary department in a country entirely dependent on rearing cattle or the Department of Agriculture had a single local professional officer, and the same was true of the Geological Survey Department. So much for the situation before independence, but I would add, not a caveat, but a gloss. It should be remembered that although there were very few, if any, Africans in senior posts, there were a number in responsible posts. For example, in 1953, a young man from Kenya, Philip Lawrence Steenkamp, a East African Boer, educated in South Africa, became district commissioner in Kalahari. His salary was less than that of his chief clerk, who was in Botswana, born in the Protectorate. Going on after independence, under self-government and after independence, and after the first general election on a common roll at the end of '64, at the beginning of '65, Seretse Khama became Prime Minister in April, and although for a time Her Majesty's Commissioner, which is what we call the Governor, continued to preside over Cabinet, he was new to the country and found little to do. The key link with London in a heavily aid-dependent, grant-aided protectorate was the financial secretary, who as it happened had been born in the Protectorate, was a European, South African, and he was now called Minister of Finance. He was quite determined not to be second-guessed by Her Majesty's Commissioner. As for localization, Seretse Khama took the crucial step of offering Botswana citizenship to any established civil servants not born in the territory. 4 key administrative officers accepted this offer and were justly rewarded. One, in due course, became Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, one Secretary for Finance Developments and later Governor of the Central Bank. The third rose to be Director of Wildlife, and the last, Secretary for Agriculture. When they accepted citizenship, their gross salaries dropped by about 14%, an encouraging demonstration that they were opting for Botswana on principle rather than for mercenary reasons. By offering citizenship, all of us, including myself who didn't want to become a Botswana citizen, were given the confidence we would be able to continue to find job satisfaction and even promotion as it was evident independence was leading to job opportunities expanding more rapidly than could be met for 5 or 6 years by local recruiting. Turnover in senior appointments of non-citizens certainly increased since new recruits were on 3-year contracts. But many non-citizens in post-independence, myself included, were now offered multiple 9-year contracts. And as it turned out, it was not until the mid-70s that the predominance of white faces in important posts significantly diminished. The government was particularly skillful at bringing in young expatriates in key areas where they could work alongside the first significant number of Botswana graduates of their own generation. Perhaps the most important cadre in this connection were the young finance and development economists recruited into the Development Planning Ministry. But also very valuable were young district development officers, mainly American, but not from USAID, who as late as 1982 were serving in districts alongside now fairly experienced indigenous district commissioners. In the professional technical cadres, localization at professional level was even slower than in the administration, although expatriate recruitment was less and less UK oriented. In the key veterinary departments, the director, a Scot, stayed in post past his own retirement age at the President's special request, and he was then, about 1980, replaced by a fully qualified and fully experienced local veterinarian. The nuts and bolts of localization were managed by 2 capable heads of establishment, Jim Hall, who of course was British, and J.J. Tabapi. J.J. Tabapi was District Commissioner's clerk I referred to, who was paid more than his DC in 1953. Both Hall and Tabapi understood that Botswana had to have a competent civil service to make a political and economic reality of formal independence. And Tabapi in particular insisted that local officers must be paid well enough to attract recruits of the necessary integrity and ability. For some years, the Finance and Development Department had pressed the arguments of the World Bank and many donors that salaries should be related to the country's resources without reference to the international rate of the job. Eventually, however, a generous salary review reversed this situation on the insistence of the President's office. If you pay peanuts, you can only hire monkeys, and monkeys asked to be helpful make trouble and are politically destabilizing. Minders have to be called in, otherwise known as international consultants. And if they call the shots, there is little hope of efficient and honest government.
So we turn to our final speaker, to Michael on localization in Hong Kong.
Yes, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not quite sure why I'm sitting in the King's chair, but perhaps it's something to do with Hong Kong being the last colony and the end of empire. I mean, I think it's very interesting today. We've heard from several speakers say that constitutional development rushed on ahead of localization. In Hong Kong, it was in many ways the other way round. The lack of any constitutional development actually slowed localization down in the 60s, 70s, and up until the signature of the joint declaration with China. Localization in Hong Kong as a concept was undoubtedly affected by security, political, and nationality issues. In fact, these issues were probably more important than education, training, and the availability of educated local candidates. In many ways, this was the opposite of the situation in the Pacific, where I served very briefly as a junior officer. And I think it may also have been the opposite of the situation as described in East Africa. I think to look at localization in Hong Kong, though, we have to have a look at the political situation post-war in the Far East. We had a civil war in China, Kuomintang versus communists, the Korean War, a population surge, as refugees swarmed into Hong Kong and the government could do little to control it. These refugees were either political, possibly part of the defeated army of Chiang Kai-shek, Southern Army, and economic. The population grew from 1 million at the time of the Japanese surrender to 4 million in the 50s. In 1956, there were some very serious riots in North Kowloon and Hong Kong. These were as a result of communists fighting with nationalists. The military had to be called in to aid the civil power. Police and the army opened fire up the end of Nathan Road and shot 80 people dead. It was the only way to restore law and order. After that, any ideas of democratic development in Hong Kong took rather a backseat. I mean, Hong Kong was also, of course, an important military base, especially after the withdrawal in the 60s from Singapore and Malaya. It was also worth remembering that the Chinese population of Hong Kong wanted one thing alone: a safe and stable environment where they could go about their daily lives without fear of dying and run their own business. The last thing they were interested in was politics. Hong Kong at that time, and continued right up to the handover, to have what I described virtually as a kind of classic colonial model, where the officials, senior officials, also had a kind of ministerial political role. The Legislative Council comprised official members, secretaries and directors, and nominated unofficials, most of whom were Chinese businessmen, the odd expatriate businessman, Indian businessman, and the notional missionary. But as Hong Kong government was concerned, it was essentially law and order and the maintenance of a kind of free economy. Development was up to business and the private sector. The civil service background in Hong Kong is very interesting because the far eastern territories of, originally of course Ceylon, but after the post-war Malaya and Hong Kong, tended to view themselves, with the possible exception of the Sudan political service, as somewhat the elite after India. And there were connections with India because certainly until the Second World War, the Viceroy of India had an oversight of policy in the Far East. That included the Straits Settlements and Hong Kong, although the civil services were entirely separate. But again, the ranks used in Hong Kong, and I believe also some in Malaya, reflected those of the Indian Empire. And it was quite interesting that they saw that link. I mean, localization per se started in Hong Kong as a result of the post-war Labour government's initiative here through the Colonial Office, which sent out all these missives about considering the claims of local candidates. And in 1950, the Hong Kong government established a Public Service Commission. Now, quite early on, it was advisory to the governor. It was non-executive. The executive power and management lay with the Establishment Secretary, later Secretary for the Civil Service. But it did not deal with the Directorate or superscale posts, perhaps as most of us would know them, which were subject to the approval of the Secretary of State. And it did not deal with the police, the administration, or the political service, as some people called it, and the judiciary. However, steps were taken. From 1961 onwards, expatriates to be recruited henceforth were to be employed only on agreement contract terms, and that depended, the first appointment, on the availability of suitable locals. However, this rule did not apply to renewal of contract, promotion, or transfer to the permanent establishment or enrolment in HMOCS. And there were also two very important policy exceptions: the administrative service and the police. It was an unspoken policy that 50% of the officer ranks were to be filled by British, well, that could include Australian or New Zealand appointees, British officers on permanent and pensionable HMOCS terms for as long as Hong Kong was going to remain a colony. This was later reduced to 40% in 1978. It was interesting, if you look at localization in Hong Kong in about 1965, nearly all the directorate or superscale posts in the medical and health department were locally held, but not many in many of the other ranks and departments. Administrative officers are a good example. They were recruited from recent British graduates, the classic kind of colonial service model. In theory, recent Hong Kong graduates, promotion of local officers in Hong Kong, especially from the executive and trade officer grades, transfers from other officers in Hong Kong, such as the police and others, could cover expatriates as well, and transfer of expatriate officers from other territories. It was a well-known joke in Hong Kong that officers would transfer from the Pacific 2 or 3 years prior to retirement to get a boost for their salaries on the final salary pension scheme. Of course, the upshot was, to some extent, the best people left those very territories. I think Chris Cochran had referred to that himself earlier. In fact, it became so noticeable that local candidates were not being appointed to the administrative service that in 1972 a question was asked by one of the unofficial members why there were so few. The establishment secretary replied and said, well, it was based on this assessment of character. They had to have plus something. Of course, that's totally opposite to the Chinese tradition of competitive examination as in the old Mandarin system and appointment to the public service. But I think there was a feeling in Hong Kong, certainly in the earlier days, that you had such brilliantly clever, qualified locals, but could they stand there as a police superintendent and put down a riot or deal with problems in the new territories when you needed a district officer to front up there and face them down? I think 1967-68 and the Red Guard rampage changed that, because it was very clear that local officers were committed to defending Hong Kong. The Hong Kong police local officers did a brilliant job. I think it was different thereafter. But this situation continued until 1984 with the signature of the joint declaration with China, which guaranteed that Hong Kong would remain unchanged for 50 years after 1997. But for our purposes here, that Hong Kong would be ruled after 1997 by local Hong Kong Chinese. In other words, Beijing would not send communist cadres from the mainland. This was one of the great fears of Hong Kong people. What they were saying is they would allow our colleagues or subordinates to be promoted to straddle 1997. And on paper, that was a very significant concession. They would not post anyone in. It was a watershed, 1984-85. The permanent pensionable service, HMOCS, had come to an end then, continued as long as that, you see, up to the end of 1983 in Hong Kong. That all came to an end. Henceforth, localization was stepped up. Contracts were not renewed unless you could demonstrate that the local officer was not available. The other interesting point, though, about Hong Kong is that another and difficult issue arose about localization. The joint declaration said Hong Kong Chinese could run Hong Kong. And the Chinese had defined the principal posts, basically the secretary level posts, the government secretariat, and the directors of the sensitive departments, Commissioner of Police, Immigration. But it was Hong Kong Chinese. And to fill these posts, you had to be able to demonstrate that these Hong Kong Chinese were capable of being Chinese nationals. It's an interesting point here. It wasn't worded that they had to be local civil servants. It said they had to be Chinese, capable of being Chinese. Unfortunately, this did exclude some very able officers of an Indian background or Macanese, Portuguese background who were local, not HMOCS, but who clearly couldn't meet the Chinese nationality requirement. So we had to do something about that. A compensation scheme was introduced. Initially, the Hong Kong Government Limited Compensation Scheme, then a general compensation scheme by Her Majesty's Government in the United Kingdom. It was necessary to do this because although Hong Kong had a very large number of highly competent, by that date, local officers in the administrative service, there were too few at the senior ranks from which to be able to choose the directors or future secretaries. So this compensation scheme was introduced. Initially, the limited compensation scheme. It was also a scheme used, and I think we can mention it now, to remove officers in sensitive posts, which included local officers who might have been, for example, the special branch, who might have been at risk after the handover. But its public purpose was to aid localisation. In 1995, Her Majesty's government finally agreed a general compensation scheme for the remaining HMOCS officers, of whom there were about 500 left in 1997. Retirement under the scheme was voluntary. You didn't have to go. If you had to go, you would have gone under the slightly more generous limited compensation scheme. So retirement was voluntary. The youngest group, who were aged between about 38 and 45 in 1997, nearly all left. Not because of fears about Chinese interference at all, but because they thought at that age they could get another career job somewhere else, and if they stayed in Hong Kong, clearly they couldn't occupy the top post because they couldn't become Chinese nationals. As 1997 approached, we had always intended to discuss localisation of these top posts with the Chinese, because we were fulfilling this requirement to promote local Chinese to fill these posts so they could straddle the handover. We always intended to do so, but in the event, as 1996 ticked on and on and on, and the row between Chris Patten and China became worse over the introduction of elected members into the legislature, we decided not to do so. And the reason we didn't do so was interesting. One, because had we discussed it with the Chinese, we would have in effect given them a veto of saying that my colleague or subordinate can't have that post, Mr. XY would. They know their loyalty then. What would happen in the last 7 and 8 months? It would prejudice their freedom of action after the 30th of June 1997. It would have led to selection on political grounds. And above all, the joint declaration which we'd signed with the Chinese in 1984 said that locals who were Chinese could straddle 1997. So as Chris Patten said, what more needed to be said? The other arguments against consulting them formally were that there was a massive argument going on with the Chinese about direct elections. It was nothing to do with direct elections to ministerial responsibility. Officials retained ministerial responsibility right up to the handover. And it would have given them another stick to beat us with. So in the event, we didn't talk to the Chinese or negotiate with them about which local would be appointed. We just advised them in advance who was suitable, confirmed that they were Chinese nationals, and 3, that they would replace these British officers, and went ahead and promoted them. It's interesting, but the Chinese confirmed every one of those local officers in office just after the handover. There was an exception in one sense of a political appointment as Secretary of Justice, with the post of the Attorney General was called. But that wasn't a question of get rid of anyone. It's simply that an expatriate officer who's present with us today had remained as Attorney General right up to the handover. So it's very, very interesting. I think what you can say in the Hong Kong case is that, yes, the Chinese were highly sceptical about any advances to political development. They said, you've been there more than 150 years, you've done absolutely nothing until 1992, why are you doing it now? But they also, and if you look back to the negotiations in 1983-84, they also almost wanted to take over a classic colonial situation where there wasn't this troublesome worry about giving a local voice. And Hong Kong remained as an official-led government after the handover. In some ways, perhaps it looks slightly more similar to the US administration, where the chief executive would appoint you know, the various officials and Secretary of State. It is an interesting point. In Hong Kong, localisation was slow getting started in some way, yes. It didn't start until the Joint Declaration was signed. Whilst Britain was still responsibility, we wanted to be able to call the white guys out onto the street if absolutely necessary. But once that happened, it happened very quickly, and there were many, many competent locals who could take it over. And I think in the end, Hong Kong will have to be said to be a success in a localisation, in the localisation sense. It was different. It was much easier. The British have been there for hundreds of years. There was a very for hundreds of years. There was a very industrious local community. But it just shows you how things are different. In Africa, constitutional development pushed it. In Hong Kong, it held it back. Thank you.
I'd like to open the discussion now to you all for your comments and for questions to our panel. Please, can I ask you all to identify who you are and to speak as loudly and clearly as you can for the microphones around the room.
Can you tell me, this is to Michael Waters, if the Independent Commission Against Corruption still exists in Hong Kong?
Yes, that definitely still exists, yes. Well, the Independent Commission, Hong Kong had been...
Could we have the questions, please? We couldn't hear.
Sorry, my name is Minter, Chris Minter. I was in Hong Kong as a businessman. The Independent Commission Against Corruption, and perhaps the speaker can explain more rapidly than I can why it was set up. I merely wanted to know if it still existed.
Yes, in 1974, an independent commission against corruption was set up by the government in Hong Kong to deal with the issue of corruption, which had been gradually getting worse from the late 60s and which affected some departments more than others. But the ones perhaps it particularly affected were certain areas in the police force, the public works department, building controls, planning for flats and things like that. It was set up to deal with corruption because it was felt it was very difficult for the police anti-corruption branch to investigate, if you like, almost themselves or their colleagues in other departments. It's too, we haven't got the time to go into the detailed background, but it does still exist.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Walker. Question for John Ducker. Just briefly, I used to hear about Mad Mike in Aden. What can you explain a bit?
Mad Mike was battalion commander of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, who were Mitchell, and he was sent into they were sent into a part of Aden which had been lost to government control. That's all. I mean, it became a big headline in this country. It was one small event in the territory.
Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Jeremy Matthews, Hong Kong, 1968, 1997. I was the last survivor of that group described by Mike Waters. And just a couple of days before the handover at a farewell drinks do, somebody came up to me and said, "I've never seen a live dinosaur before," which made me feel really good. If I just pick up a point made by John Ducker about the development of tertiary education and how that affected localisation in my department, or rather how it failed to aid localisation. When I joined the government in 1968 as Crown Counsel, there was no faculty of law at the University of Hong Kong nor at the Chinese University. So if you wanted to be a lawyer in Hong Kong at that time, you had to qualify in this country, and that meant you had to come from a rich family. So the pool was very small, and the family, having made the investment in getting their son or daughter qualified as a solicitor or barrister, did not want their child to enter government legal service. The Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong wasn't established until 1970, so the first law graduates, local law graduates, were not rolling off the production line until 1973-74. At that time, the legal department, where I started as a junior Crown Counsel, just expanded exponentially as Hong Kong itself changed from a manufacturing centre to a large financial centre. When I joined the department in 1968, we had 40 lawyers, a few Chinese, 2 or 3 from Singapore, Malaysia. When I took over as attorney in 1988, we had 250 lawyers, total staff of 1,000. So the pressure on us to localise was driven by the considerations that Mike Waters had said, but was held back by, first of all, the slow trickle of law graduates coming out locally, and secondly, by the competition with the private sector, because most local graduates very much wanted to practice on their own. They were unattracted to government legal service. So in order to fill the gap, we were staffed almost entirely by lawyers on contract, many from Australia and New Zealand. And that itself acted as a disincentive to localise. Local lawyers would look at this department, which was then the largest law firm in Hong Kong, 250 lawyers, and they'd see this solid mass of expatriates, many of whom had many more years of experience. And so it seemed quite a turn-off. People didn't want to join the government. There had been some efforts made at localisation, but they were designed mainly to try and keep the few that we had in the service, instead of trying to draw them in. So when I became attorney, I decided that we simply could not continue like this. The handover was going to take place in 9 years. So I formed a strategy with the chairman of the bar and the president of the local law society and said we've really got to work together, because it is simply not going to be acceptable politically after 1997 for Hong Kong to continue to draw its legal services from short-term expatriate lawyers. You'll need to have a legal department that is rooted in the community that it serves. Now, I have to say that the chairman of the bar and the president of the Law Society were extremely helpful in working towards that strategy. It took quite a long time to get going. We had to invest in schemes to fast-track locals. And I have to say that some of these schemes were very much resented by local lawyers who saw it as patronising, who felt that we were really treating them as second-class lawyers. And it was a major part of my job to persuade them that they needed to gain experience in a fast-track way if they were going to take over as the senior lawyers in what was an extremely large legal enterprise. I checked this morning, sorry, I just finished very briefly. I checked this morning to see what had happened with my old department. There is still one very senior expatriate lawyer, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and there are 3 other expat lawyers in the department, and it's still about 250. So it took much longer than we thought, but it looks as if the department has finally reached the point that I thought it should have reached by 1997, but it's taken another 15 years.
John, would you like to respond to
I don't think I have anything further to add on this particular point. I've got a few more things I would like to say, if you could allow the time.
I'll add
in
something
relation,
on that.
would you like to add
Yeah,
anything?
I mean, it's very interesting that Jeremy Matthews has said that. That absolutely was an amazing problem to localise the legal profession. But yet contrast that with the two, because you couldn't get the qualifications until, but contrast that with the two jobs that didn't need any qualifications per se. The administrative service and the Hong Kong police. But in the 70s and 60s, locals couldn't get appointments to them because they were the country. So there was the contrast. It was very interesting. Yes.
John, did you have a point you wanted to add in relation to another?
Well, the point I would just like to stress again was the pressure, the time pressure of this localization. Take, for example, Sudan. It adopted the Sudanization policy in 1947. Due to be carried out over 20 years. The country became independent 7 years later. So at the time of Sudan's independence, only 15% of the Division 1 post was filled by Sudanese. In 1962, 8 years after independence, only 4 of the main departments had attained 100% Sudanization. It's very similar. People have spoken, I don't know much about the Gold Coast, a lot of people have been said, but I do know that as the number of Africans in the civil service increased before independence, so did the number of expatriates. And it only, the number of Africans, proportion of Africans, only exceeded 50% about the time of independence.
That was partly, at least because the period leading up to independence, there was a large recruitment from this country of contract assistant secretaries to staff the new ministries. And so they weren't overseas service on pensionable terms. They were doing 2-tour or 4-year contracts.
But what I'm trying to stress is the level of experience of the Africans at independence was relatively very, very short term. Nigeria is the same. The first steps towards localization in Nigeria took place in 1948 when Sir Hugh Foote was Chief Secretary. The Central and Regional Public Service Commissions were created in 1952. By 1952, the number of the high-level positions held by Africans was 685, but that was still only 19% of the total of the country, the 4 administrations, 2 regional and 3 regional and the central administration. In East Africa, at the time of the East African Royal Commission, which reported in 1955, they said in their report that 4 territories of Eastern Africa were not yet in sight of being able to staff their own administrations. Now that was only, in the case of Tanganyika, 6 years before independence. Tanganyika is a particular, to me...
Thank you, John. Could we
Okay.
just open that up to some more questions? The gentleman here.
Peter Soon. I think for this intervention, I speak in my capacity as formerly head of the Law Department at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Jeremy's remarks, I think, if you look at localization of the judiciary, it is actually quite extraordinary the extent to which that has been delayed. I mean, if you look at the Pacific today, you will find the majority of the higher judiciary are expatriates. And that was true until recently in Lesotho, in Swaziland, in Chile. So, in a sense, the reasons for that I think are very interesting, but it's perhaps something to recall that how long the process has been in finding local judges. Some of the reasons is that local practitioners don't want to be judges. I remember an African Chief Justice saying to me, I'm trying to recruit people for the bench. I tell them the salary, private practitioners making fabulous salaries, in private practice are not interested. So there is that economic factor. There are other factors as well. Extremely interesting.
Would any of the panel like to respond? John, would you like to respond? Would you like to respond to that?
On a lighter note,
the East African Court of Appeal remained largely expatriate until very recently.
And for example,
and a good thing too.
Namibia has an expatriate Court of Appeal. Almost all South Pacific territories are appellate, they're almost entirely expatriates.
one of the best jobs in the world is chairman of the Court of Appeal in Brunei.
Yes.
And I believe that is still held by, undoubtedly known to some of you, Sir Dennis Roberts, who was Chief Justice and then I think Chief Secretary in Hong Kong for many years before retiring to Cyprus. Sir Dennis must now be nearly 90, but as far as I know he still goes strong, because the one thing the Sultan of Brunei, a Muslim state, will not countenance is having a Chinese Chief Justice, as Hong Kong obviously does today.
Yes, that's quite true. He was originally Attorney General, then Chief Secretary, then from Chief Secretary to Chief Justice. So much for separation of powers, but that's
Thank you very much. The gentleman here, could you identify who you are?
Lynn Riley, can I just make a comment about Botswana? And I'm really looking for your reaction, Simon. I worked there as the head of the planning office of the Ministry of Local Government and Lands for a couple of years, 1978 and 79. So I was in charge of the DODs and DODANs that you were talking about. My point is that there were an enormous, all those officers, the DO, District Officers Development and District Officers there, were indeed expatriates. They were mostly Peace Corps or IBS. There were many of us working in that whole field, expatriates. And this is long after independence. But what struck me, which I have not found elsewhere in Africa to the same extent, was there was no resistance to this. The Botswana seemed only too pleased, as long as we didn't stick our noses into their cattle affairs, which was somewhat sensitive, sorry. They welcomed. As long as you did your job, as long as you produced results, there was no sort of friction. Would you agree with that this is rather exceptional, and would you provide a reason for it?
I certainly agree. My personal experience was that the Botswana, encouraged by Seretse Khama, the English wife, had every reason to regard well-disposed Europeans who gave every sign of wanting to mix with them, to the extent individuals wished to mix. Because the history of the Protectorate was that it was established in the teeth of Cecil Rhodes's aggressive attempts to develop a settler empire in Central Africa. An empire from white miners, white ranchers, and so on. And the missionaries we used, and they used the chiefs to go to Queen Victoria in 1896, they assured them that an imperial officer would always protect them from the various political polities in southern Africa that white men controlled, like the Transvaal Republic, the Cape Colony, and so on. So from then on, they knew they had the protection of the British government. Quite often in the history of the Protectorate, which was well over 80 years, the British government showed every sign of letting go, but the local whites always made it clear they wanted to be in the Protectorate, not in South Africa.
Right.
And I think everybody who's worked in Botswana, as you say, felt that he was likely to be welcomed there. White men per se, of course, descended, if that's the word, from being a ruling elite in the civil service and so on. becoming a minority valued for their skills.
I agree.
They wouldn't keep you on in the government if you didn't know your job. And they were far better, in my experience, the Botswana government as a result, and I'm talking both politicians, senior officials, in picking the expatriates they needed. In a way, I've seen people in East Africa, in West Africa, quite hopelessly useless and overpaid by somebody else, being brought into the country
Thank you.
I could just interject a quotation from Suretsi Kama, which I came across, which is highly relevant. He's quoted as saying, "We should never sacrifice efficiency on the altar of localization."
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think there was another very famous saying. Simon would tell us who it was. It's either Suretsi Kama or another Botswana president who said, "Not all Botswana heroes are Botswana." I think he was referring to the last resident commissioner, but perhaps...
Well, I think that's...
And I'm not sure why.
Well, the last resident commissioner, not the man I was referring to, the Queen's Commissioner, but Peter Hawkins was, I'm not suggesting he was unusually sort of radical for the colonial service. He was just a first-class representative of what our service stood for. And he became, he was originally in Bechuanaland. He became government secretary number 2 there, and was appointed resident commissioner of Bechuanaland in 56. And he worked immensely hard to make what he knew, and many South Africans and Rhodesians knew, intelligent people, to try and establish an apartheid state in the mid-20th century was lunacy. But a lot of people didn't, and Focus is the man. I think Suretsi was thinking of.
I'd like to Jonathan Lawley, ex-Northern Rhodesia and Southern Africa generally, entirely agree with you. I saw it in the 50s. I saw Bechuanaland and Bechuanaland in the 50s. I actually happened to have been at school in India, UK, Southern Rhodesia and South Africa, and I joined the colonial service to get away from racism.
Yeah.
That was the politics of that part of the world, as those of us who are familiar with it know. You know, after World War II, the British were really needed in that part of the world to steer the region away from the politics of white privilege in Southern Rhodesia and in South Africa. Unfortunately, this came at a time when HMG just really wanted out of the region. Nevertheless, I think we can take a lot of pride in the way that we pioneered black management and administration for the whole region. And this very day, I've been talking to a Zambian entrepreneur on the telephone. I'm seeing him next Monday, whose company trained 1,000 people for the Olympic Games security in this country.
Would you like to respond?
But of course, what I've been talking about with regard to Southern Africa is taken for granted in West Africa.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, wherever I've been in what was the empire, there is always, if you look and if you know your South Africa, there's evidence of the very understandable racial prejudice we had against backward people. We thought we were new better, that was why we were there, and it took us time to overcome it. And I went out as a boy soldier of 18 doing national service to Kaduna, and gradually got the idea that, well, there had to be some reason why we were needed, boys of 18, to command Nigerian soldiers. It must be that we had some racial ingrained quality. And it took a few lessons from more senior men, both black and white, to teach me otherwise. And some of my colleagues never got the message.
But we weren't like, we didn't sort of incorporate our religion to justify our racial attitudes. And, you know, apartheid was a really pretty nasty, awful thing, which we steered really well away from.
Could we move on to the gentleman next to you?
Yes. Peter Wood. I worked for the last 20 years of the last millennium in Mozambique. And it was communist, of course. And as a forester, I was looking at the professional officers, 75% of whom were women. Now, I just wonder whether it's something to do with the politics of communism, and that capitalism doesn't foster advancing women's education and training. But do you think it is? Because this, it's not our colony, but it's now a member of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I worked in Central Asia for some of the former Soviet territories there for a number of years. And one of the things the Soviets did, above all, was to educate people. And men, women as much as men. They were very successful in raising literacy and other skill levels.
Would you like to comment? No? Would you like to comment?
John Smith. I'd like to make two comments about localization after independence. In northern Nigeria, where I was running a staff college from 4 years to about 8 years after independence, localization was northernization, because the northern Nigeria was far behind southern Nigeria in terms of education. And there were loads of southern Nigerians looking for jobs as expatriates left, and the government wanted to keep these posts open for their own people as they started to come along. So they went and recruited new expatriates from elsewhere in the world. A large number were Tamils from Sri Lanka, who were pretty unhappy in Sri Lanka, and fine, they spoke English, no trouble. The other major group came from Yugoslavia, and I found myself being asked to run courses to teach English to Yugoslav expatriates now working for the country. When I left Gilbert Islands just before independence, the entire medical service was fully localized, with the exception of a consultant surgeon. All our doctors at that stage had been trained at the Fiji Medical School, which did not offer, produced excellent doctors, but did not offer a qualification that was recognized elsewhere. Everyone said, oh, we must upgrade the Fiji Medical School, introduce metropolitan qualifications and so on. Now the medical service in Kiribati is almost 100% run by Chinese, because all the local doctors, now qualified with metropolitan qualifications, find it much easier to work outside their own country, where they earn much more money.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely... Although it's an interesting point that John raised about the medical department. A lot of those were Ellis officers, of course.
Oh, yes, they were.
Tuvalu, and who then split into the Gilberts and Tuvalu. But yes, you are seeing that. It's very interesting, isn't it? I just think it's very interesting that it's gone backwards, localisation.
Well, I think it is a major problem everywhere, and it was always a problem, certainly in West Africa, with professional jobs. I mean, I can remember chairing a meeting 2 or 3 years after independence where people were talking about localisation, and somebody said, well, what about forestry officers and surveyors? Oh, we can go on hiring expatriates for those jobs. Nobody wanted to go to bush. They all wanted to be in administrative jobs in headquarters.
That's true, but I was just going to add, I think one of the issues in the Pacific was that you got a decent local officer who was promoted to administrative officer, district commissioner, anything. The next thing, he was a minister. So he had left. Because it was so small, you lost them to the civil service and they became ministers, president, prime minister.
That did not worry me on the whole. I thought it was a natural progression. When politics came along, some of the first people, inevitably, who'd been well-educated, well-trained, were going to become politicians. Indeed, I remember in the Solomon Islands, the first 2 Solomon Islanders I met and entertained in my own home, both education officers, finished up as Governor General and Prime Minister at independence, much to the irritation of the former Director of Education, but I had made sure they transferred to the administration because we needed them. But I think one has to accept that. And then I found in Nigeria, many people I trained went on into politics, some became businessmen, and many became directors of expatriate or global companies, we would say, often chairman of these companies. And it was this kind of natural progression, and they were very, very significant in what they did wherever they went. I was delighted when the BBC took me back to meet somebody I trained in Nigeria a couple of years ago. He finished up as a director of a bank, having qualified as a banker and passed all the examinations, and his last job as chief executive of the Nigerian Mint. I found him as a grade 2 teacher in a remote part of the country where nobody had ever achieved very much at all, persuaded him, got him onto the administrative service training course, and he finished up doing very well.
Thank you very much, sir.
Philip Burcock, Sudan and Northern Rhodesia. John Buckner mentioned briefly the Sudan. It's the first mention we've had of it today. But it's worth remembering that when I was recruited for the political office in 1949, I received there were no longer any pensionable terms. There was a 20-year contract. Of course, a young man of 21 or 22, a 20-year contract is lifetime, life, isn't it? So there was no hesitation with my contemporaries in taking this 20-year contract. But the point is that the decision had obviously been made some way before then that there should be a clear sign to the Sudanese that the British were going. They were not going to be there forever. And I just wonder if this was the first sign of this happening and of localization being promised.
Well, as I mentioned, the Sudanization policy was adopted in 1944, and the country was independent 7 years later. Now, that followed the treaty between Britain and Egypt, which was signed in 1953. Yeah. I don't think anybody in 1944 would have thought that the condominium was going to come to an end as soon as that. They had no idea it was going to come that soon. So but that was a sort of strategic stroke diplomatic arrangement which the country just had to accept. I have to say, in the mid-1970s, I was working on the Sudan when I was at the bank, and travelling the regions of the country there, I mean, the paucity of people with technical qualifications willing to work there was really awful. It was very difficult to get anybody to work anywhere away from Sudan. You get as far as what medicine, that's about it.
Yeah. Could I add to that? I was in Khartoum for 3 years in 1990, and it was quite clear, many Sudanese made it quite clear to me that they hung on to the British to keep the Egyptians out. Egypt had a claim to run the Sudan, and they were anxious to enforce it. There were plenty of Sudanese working in Saudi Arabia as engineers. The country was very dependent on it. It had muddled up its economic policies and so on. And it is and of course there was the problem of the south, which is only now being resolved now.
It's not resolved.
I mean, the Sudan is, even compared with Nigeria, the Sudan is vast and empty. And the total, it's just amazing that we ran it as well as we did.
Gentlemen here.
one of the issues we have...
So could you identify yourself again, please, for the
Colin
tape?
Fuller, ex-administration Kenya. One of the issues we haven't discussed today, but which can be very frustrating for people in the localization and training business, was brain drain. There were many examples, but one I can think of when Riley, my colleague, set up the School of Administration in Mauritius and identified a head for it and gave him the training. The next thing is the UN steals him. And, you know, various departments in the UN did this, and the World Bank the same. And they did it with small countries, because they could get plenty of Indians, because Indians, there were so many well-qualified graduates, no problem. So they stole people from the small countries. It was diabolical.
Did you have a...
Yeah, that always happened. Even I was, not in Hong Kong, but in the Western Pacific, one of the most promising local Ellis Tuvaluan officers who'd come back from university in New Zealand, went to the USP, University of the South Pacific, and that kind of thing mirrors exactly what you've said, that you lost people like that, yes. Many cases.
To go back to the judiciary, the problem in the Western Pacific still is they don't trust their own. And they would never, even today, trust a senior judge, even a Chief Justice, to hear a case with different tribal loyalties and language. They just will not do it. So that's one of the problems. They hire expatriates and they'll go on doing it. But the consequence of that is just recently they hired an Australian justice, got him in post, and then it was discovered he was an escapee from justice in Australia, where he had been convicted of a traffic offence, and this will remind us of here, and passed it on to somebody else. So they had to undo that, but that didn't in any way cause a loss of faith in the expatriate judge. And today, we have many experiences like John. But the key thing is this, is they do all have very fond memories of all of us who did a good job on their behalf. And I think that needs to be said as a conclusion. There is a regular request, please come back. And the answer is not a chance because of the circumstances. But there is that thanks and graciousness. And just to add to John Smith, brain drain is a real problem in Colonial. All the medics are gone, all the lawyers are gone. They're in Australia and New Zealand, they've got metropolitan qualification. They escape the racial divide, they escape their families, because the custom is to share the money and the cargo. So if you go back to the question of standards, metropolitan standards, have led to the brain drain, and that will never ever be escaped from.
Did the panel want to respond?
Well, I mean, I can well believe that. That wasn't and isn't a problem in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, than what you've just described, because you can earn so much in the private sector or whatever the government there, and the salaries were so high. But I can see exactly what you mean in the Pacific. That's a huge problem.
Of course, the other part of the world where brain drain has happened on a huge scale is the oil states of the Middle East. Anybody who has a good training can get a job in Dubai, Qatar, or Saudi Arabia.
We have probably a minute left for a further question or comment.
Well, just following that up, it might affect the crucial states, the Gulf states, have depended very greatly upon the trained Sudanese who were left behind when we went. But they didn't stay to run the Sudan. They went to the crucial states and to Saudi Arabia. Incidentally, it was Donald Hawley, his political agent, who went to Khartoum to recruit quite a few of them. And that has gone on for 50 years.
Of course, they recruited from Pakistan.
Yes.
There was a good deal of Saudi investment in, I believe there still is, in Sudan.
Yes, yes.
Which I suppose is some sort of return for the Sudanese.
Well, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our three speakers. Fascinating discussion, and thank you to you all. It's really set me thinking about this legacy and lessons learned of localization forward to the present time, thinking about the international involvement, peacekeeping in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So thank you to our speakers and thank you to you all.